I mean, when the entire Democratic Party is getting together and deciding who is going to lead the Democrats in the House of Representatives. Well, it's not the entire Democratic Party. It's all the Democrats in the House of Representatives. When they all get together and say, who is going to be our leader here in this caucus, in this club, in this group of Democrats, all the Democrats. And the two people who are in final place in the final runoff election are two good, solid, progressive members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is now, I believe, the largest caucus within the Democratic Party. When that happens, that tells you things are changing. Things are changing rapidly. And if the Democratic Party wants to get ready for 2020, it needs to nail down a couple of positions. Now, I realize, we've from our conversations with Congressman Pocan and Congressman Khanna and Tom Perez, whatever his title is, Chairman, I guess, Perez, and others in the Democratic Party, that, what we have learned over the last year is that the Democrats, they campaigned on basically health care, jobs, and ending the culture of corruption. They believe that those things are the winners and they're going to carry them forward. Donald Trump campaigned, and most of the Republicans campaigned, on brown people are trying to invade the country and black people are trying to steal your vote, and among other things. And, it seems to have worked for them. And so what I'm looking at, and we're going to bring your jobs back from overseas. The Republicans were campaigning on that. Now, a recession is going to put a serious dent in that argument. But there's a couple of things here that, in my opinion, the Democrats need to reclaim. So I'm not saying that this should necessarily replace these top three that they've come up with, because I think those are all well thought out. And maybe it's time to come up with 5 or 6 and call it a contract with America or some variation. I mean, Newt Gingrich did this in '96 and it worked. It worked very effectively. It helped the Republicans take control of the House for, more than one congressional session for the first time since 1932. So, really since 1930 was when they took control. They left, they lost it in the election of 32. So, it works. So what are those issues? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what should be issues that the Democrats should be running on as we're heading for 2020. Donald Trump is already running for president. He has been literally since the day he was inaugurated, or maybe the day after, but it was within 24 hours of his inauguration. He had set up his presidential campaign committee, set up a PAC, started doing fundraising. He's raised tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. A lot of it, of course, is going to the legal defense for his kids. But, a lot of it is going to be, and he's making money on these rallies that he holds, in addition to getting his ego strokes and things. So what are the things that we're going to talk about? I think the first thing the Democrats really need to deal with is immigration. And the reason I say this is, and I've been talking about this a lot over the last couple of days on this program, and I feel like a voice in the wilderness. I don't hear this conversation anywhere else. I don't hear this conversation on any of the television networks. I don't hear this conversation even on other progressive shows. I'm not seeing this conversation in the progressive blogosphere. And it's a conversation that we need to have. The Republicans are saying that the Democrats are in favor of open borders, right? Trump is just literally tweeting that out. Democrats want open borders, and Democrats want people who aren't even citizens to vote. Neither one of those things are true. Yes, there are some towns and communities where in local elections, people are saying, and it's not just Democrats, it's probably not Republicans, but it's not just Democrats. People are saying, well, yeah, we'd like everybody in our community to be able to vote on what's going on in our community, even if they're not a citizen, particularly in communities that have a large immigrant population. And you can build a case for that, but that's this little tiny peripheral thing that Fox News and Sinclair and whatnot will turn, and the Republican Party will turn into this meme about, oh, Democrats want everybody. But it has been the Democratic position, basically since the 1920s. I think it was 1924 that we passed, the first serious immigration law. My grandparents slipped in underneath it when, or at least my grandfather did when he came here in 1917. from Norway. They just kind of slipped in underneath that. But we established this immigration law. Yeah, it was a fairly racist immigration law. It basically said that immigrants could only come into the United States in the proportion that they were ethnically already represented in the United States. So if we were 17% African American, only 17% of the immigrants could come from Africa. If we were 70%, 60%, whatever it was, white, only the immigrants could come from white countries. If we were 10%, I don't know what the percentages are, but whatever it was, that was how it was allocated, right up until the 60s. And then Lyndon Johnson said, wait a minute, this is crazy. This is designed to keep America exactly as it is, a majority white country. And why don't we just, let the chips fall where they may? White people are not the majority in the world. And, what does the color of your skin have to do with anything anyway, in terms of being able to be a citizen and in terms of being able to be a contributing member of society? It's time for us to drop this essentially racial element to our immigration policy. And they did. They changed the law. And they introduced a lottery, which included all of the countries in the world, which Donald Trump is trying to do away with. And, and they introduced a whole new set of laws. So there's the immigration piece of it, but there's also the enforcement of immigration piece of it. And this is where, and I've been arguing for this for a long time, Bernie and I used to talk about this way back in the day. In fact, when he endorsed my book, Rebooting the American Dream, there's a whole the last chapter of the book is about this topic. That if somebody is not in this country legally, they should not be allowed to work. Now, this is a position that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party took from the 1920s, when we passed our first immigration laws, right up until 1986. And what happened in 1986 was the Republicans were in charge, or at least in charge of the White House. And I believe they had the Senate. I could be wrong. But, Reagan was in the White House. He got past his comprehensive immigration reform, which included amnesty for 5 or 6 million people who were here, and that was all good. I mean, it was actually a fairly reasonable reform. It was supported by a lot of Democrats. And it included a provision that said that if an employer hires somebody who is not a citizen of this country, that employer can be subject to fines or jail. That's still the law. But Reagan, responding to the meatpacking and in particular the construction industry, and there are a bunch of big construction industry bigwigs that to this day are major funders of Republican candidates and Republican causes. And some of their names are legendary. So, these guys said, no, let's just, stop putting employers in jail. It'll bust the unions. And Reagan was in full union busting mode. And so Reagan said, that's it, okay, I'm not going to put any more employers in jail. And he didn't. And neither did George Bush after him. And neither did Bill Clinton after him. And neither did George Bush after him, and neither did Barack Obama after him, and Donald Trump still isn't doing this. They're doing these big high-profile raids, and occasionally they'll even bust a manager of a store, but that's not really the employer. They're not going up the corporate chain. They're not going after the bigwigs. They're not penalizing the corporations. And Democrats need to reclaim that issue. That's number one. And number two is trade and tariffs. Democrats have always been on the position. I mean, this goes back to the founding of the Republic. Although arguably, it was the George Washington administration and Alexander Hamilton, who were both Federalists, today you'd call them Republicans, who promoted this idea that, we use tariffs. But the Republican Party largely abandoned the idea of tariffs with Richard Nixon, reaching out to China, and then in a big way with Ronald Reagan. And it wasn't until 1992 that the Democratic Party broadly, not all the Democrats, it's never been all the Democrats, it was a little more than half back then, with this whole idea of the new Democrats, right? And the DLC, that the Democratic Party embraced the idea of so-called free trade. When both the Republican and the Democrat in 1992 running for president, George Bush and Bill Clinton, both said we're in favor of NAFTA, and that produced Ross Perot, a third-party candidate, who his only thing was, I'm opposed to NAFTA, and he got 20% of the vote. Right? Americans understand this. So the Democratic Party gave up this land, as it were, and the Republicans didn't seize it. So you had a period there of almost 30 years where nobody was saying, this isn't working. We have seen, officially, according to the federal government, NAFTA has caused us more than 1 million jobs. In fact, almost 2 million, I believe. But unofficially, we all know NAFTA cost us probably 5-10 million jobs, or the World Trade Organization, when you combine it, certainly on that order. And the way you fix that is with protectionist trade policies. And the Progressive Caucus gets this, I believe. I'm not sure what their official position is, but I've had enough members of the Progressive Caucus on this program who all agree with this position. But Donald Trump grabbed this thing, right, during the campaign, and he said, hey, nobody's talking about tariffs. I'm going to talk about tariffs. And the American people, there's enough Americans who still remember what America was like when there were tariffs, when companies were building things in the United States. When, North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia were filled with textile plants and things. We made our own socks. We made our own Levi's. Levi Strauss stopped manufacturing clothes in the United States right around 2001, as I recall, in the early 2000s, in the George W. Bush administration. I mean, literally, no more production in the United States. That's crazy. Right? We should be making things here in the United States. We need manufacturing jobs. So those two things, number one, immigration, and number two, trade, are two issues that Donald Trump has stolen from the Democrats. A lot of Republicans don't agree with him on. And the Democratic Party, in my opinion, should grab these two issues, consolidate them, clearly articulate them. Number one, people who are not citizens should not be able to work in the United States. We need a national Social Security check system of some kind, employer check. And number two, we need a protectionist trade policy. Those are mine. What are yours?